Hello, good morning, all. Glad to see you all. Deb Myhoff with Communitas, the facilitator of this wonderful group of the ONA Needs and Housing Production Technical Advisory Committee. This is our 9th meeting. Glad you all are here. We have quite a bit to work through and discuss. It's a bit of a continuation from the last meeting, digging into how the definition of needed housing gets translated into Goal 10 planning. And just a reminder that we thank you all for your grace in allowing us to extend this meeting to 12 o'clock today. So we'll be meeting a full 2 hours. We are adjusting the agenda ever so slightly in that rather than having a 15-minute presentation grounding the discussion at the very beginning, we'll be spreading it out for the 3 parts. So we'll do a 5-minute presentation. We'll have discussion for part 1, another little presentation to get the grounding, part 2, et cetera. And we'll make sure we leave adequate time at the end for a wrap up, since this will be the last meeting of this kind of discussion before we have draft rules later this summer. So we'll want to talk to you about that just a little bit. And goals for today are to explore the key questions pertaining to that translation process of type, characteristic, and location, and talk about ways that might sort of play out with the housing production strategies, and then also, as time allows, what that means for the housing capacity analysis. And I'm stumbling because we've had a discussion. We are really aspiring to make sure we get to that part 3 around the housing capacity analysis integration. However, if we don't quite get there, we're going to have an opportunity for you to give us some written feedback. We just want to make sure we have space for parts 1 and part 2 to be fully fleshed out. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Celestina to line us out on the racial equity framework questions for the morning.
Thank you, Deb. Good morning, everybody. Wonderful to see you all. This is our 3rd meeting of the month and our 3rd meeting digging into the sections of the racial equity framework for decision-making of restorative justice and accountability. So just a recap on that. We're looking at the entirety of the restorative justice section and just one piece of the accountability section. And like we've done for the last couple of meetings, I'll put voice to the questions for restorative justice that we'll be weaving into the discussion today. So, does this rule provide restorative justice measures for the communities most burdened? If yes, what are they? If no, what would you suggest that is within the jurisdiction of the state of Oregon? What are some other best practices or examples of restorative or transformational justice measures that would address the impact of this rule on the most burdened? These examples can be outside the jurisdiction of DLCD, but could provide concept ideas for sharing with tribal communities, local governments, businesses, culturally based nonprofit organizations, and other partners. We've also noted in each of the sections, which we'll get into momentarily, this restorative justice element being a part of our conversation as we talk about housing types, housing characteristics, and housing locations, and how we get to actual mixes or some type of translation to think about how restorative justice is present in these proposed processes. And then we have one question in the accountability section, which is, how does this rule address accountability measures for both DLCD and local governments? And just as one reminder there, the reason that we've only pulled that one question from that section of the framework is because, of course, we have the Housing Accountability Technical Advisory Committee that is running concurrently with this Needs and Production Committee, and they're tackling really the accountability questions in full. And so it's good for us to keep it in mind, but we're largely deferring to the rules that get generated from that technical advisory committee and the rest of the rulemaking process. But for our scope, the accountability questions are good to keep in mind, but somewhat limited. Deb, do you want me to just jump into part one grounding, or do you want me
Yeah,
to hand it back to
could you
you?
give me just 1 second? I failed to acknowledge all of the staff that are in the room and the resources we have. So thank you, Celestina. Just one moment. I just want to acknowledge our DLCD and OHCS staff that are here. That is Celestina, obviously. Madi is here. Ingrid, as always, is making sure the ship is running. And then Thea, thank you for being here again, also with DLCD. And Mitch, we're really glad you're here with OHCS and listening in. And then, of course, we have our subject matter experts, Alan Lazo, fresh back from a really nice vacation. Hi, Alan. And Andre Tremolay is also here. She's unable to be on camera today, but she'll be helping out as needed as well. So thank you, Celestina, for the opportunity to do that. And we'll go ahead and carry on.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Okay, so today I'm going to, again, as Deb said, ground us for a moment on this part one of the discussion that's outlined in the agenda. And so that's focusing on actually working through at this point, after all of our digging into what kinds of things are housing types, characteristics, and locations, and how do we think about that in the program, to some actual mock translation work to hone in on what exactly we're expecting of the translation from the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis housing production targets into types, characteristics, and locations. So I'm actually going to share my screen for a moment and share the Miro board that we have for notes today as a means to orient us a little bit to what that all really means. So in your packets, you had this mock scenario, which includes a set of housing production targets, which will be a number of units by affordability. And that is what is directed to be delivered by the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. One of a few things, but for the purposes of the Housing Production Strategy Program, those are the numbers that the local jurisdictions are working for and planning to meet in terms of needed housing. So then we've added these other columns to help prompt our discussion today about, okay, how do we get from affordability brackets and number of units into types, characteristics, and locations, and what are we actually expecting from each of those translations? So that's what we have as we continue down this board, and we have pulled what is somewhat new to you, which are these mock translations for types, characteristics, and locations in from the discussion memo. And we've also pulled this path A, B1, and B2 from last meeting's discussion and applied it in a way to, well, if we were to do the mock translation into housing, or if we were to do a real translation into housing types, and we were to take a path A, what would that look like? Same with B1 and B2. And this was also included in the discussion memo for today's meeting. But I wanted to touch on two things before I kind of preview and review the characteristics and location section, which is one, the term safe harbor, and then two, kind of what paths we're looking at, just to review and maybe clarify as needed. So we've been using the term safe harbor to explore how the rules for the housing production strategy, and particularly translating the housing production targets into types, characteristics, and locations, with the term safe harbor as a possible path. So I'm actually going to drop a definition in the chat of what a safe harbor is, as it's defined in a related set of rules here at DLCD, which is our Division 24 rules. Those apply to Goal 14, which is urbanization. So it is not specifically the division that we are working in, which is Division 8 for the Housing Production Strategy Program, but they're very closely related. And if needed, we could certainly consider adding a definition similar to this one into Division 8. So let me see here if I can get that pasted. Okay, so I'll put voice to that, which is that a safe harbor means an optional course of action that a local government may use to satisfy a requirement, in this case of Goal 14. The use of a safe harbor prescribed in this division will satisfy the requirement for which it is prescribed. The safe harbor is not the only way or necessarily the preferred way to comply with the requirement, and it is not intended to interpret the requirement for any purpose other than applying a safe harbor within this division. So in a little bit of more plain language, as we've been talking about it, it provides a predictable path for a local government to say, we're going through these rules, and there are also less predictable paths that we can take and do things a little bit differently, and produce our housing production strategy report and the included elements, and have DLCD review and assess whether or not it meets the rule, or we can consider taking a safe harbor option if that's the right fit for our local government. So we're not going to dig into this much more today, but if there is any remaining confusion about that term and how it's being used, please do reach out to us, because we certainly want everyone to be on the same page and able to interact with the options that are on the table. So one of the options on the table for types, characteristics, and locations translations is that a safe harbor is provided. And then the second thing I wanted to clarify here is that in terms of understanding the paths and kind of the term that has popped up since our last meeting about whether there's a hybrid path, which kind of implies there's one option or another option and we're going somewhere in the middle. Just wanted to revisit the idea that there are other options that as staff we did not include in our materials because they're not paths that we're considering at the department and really aren't viable. And the one most namely is that the rules would prescribe exactly what a jurisdiction must translate their housing production target into exactly in terms of types, characteristics, and locations. That the rules will just spell out all of that, and that is the only way that a jurisdiction can go from those targets to, again, types, characteristics, and locations. So that would be on the far end of the spectrum that you might consider path B1 and B2 as being maybe a hybrid of potentially that extreme of you must translate it exactly this way versus another end of the spectrum being that these are the outcomes that we want, and there's no safe harbor or no direction, and a local jurisdiction might will proceed without a safe harbor or additional direction and rule, and then the agency would review the HPS and then provide its evaluation. We did not queue up time for questions on this. We've got 3.
Well, we can get in discussion. We can take questions in the discussion time as well. Do you have anything else you'd like to cover, Celestina, before we get going?
I don't think so. Yeah, that kind of frames up the clarifications we wanted to make. And so each the types, characteristics, and locations are queued up for us to discuss what the right translation format might be and how much direction to give. So I think that's it. Deb, thank you.
Great, thank you. So as you all, I'm sure, have absorbed, we're getting into the weedy details. That's one. 2, we do have limited time together and a few weedy details we'd like to get into. So how we're going to organize this is we're going to take types, then we're going to take characteristics, and we're going to take locations. You'll see they have some questions in common, and then there's some nuances of those in that in the memo with questions. But generally, as Celestina just mentioned, sort of what format, what kind of information could cities use to arrive at conclusions? Could or should there be some sort of safe harbor? How would DLCD evaluate? Those are common among them. So we're going to do 15 minutes for each of those categories. So 10:15 to 10:30, we're going to talk about types. and so on and so forth with characteristics, location, 15-minute each. I'm going to stay sort of strict because we really want to make sure we get to the remainder of the agenda. We will absolutely be giving you an opportunity to weigh in after this meeting and add comments, just acknowledging that this is limited time. So some apologies there, but also just this is the reality of where we're at. What would be particularly helpful is as you are thinking about these things and you've read through the memo, if you see some really tough sticky points that you think maybe are problematic in the scenarios that have been presented or ideas that folks are talking about, it'd be super helpful to hear about that. And or ideas that you think are pretty great and should be considered. Okay, so with that sort of setup, we're going to get rolling here. Shannon, I see you have your hand up. Thank you. Uh-oh, are you there, Shannon? Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Just a little slow on the uptake today.
It's okay.
So I'm just gonna, I think we might get there, so I'm not gonna take too much time. Just it freaks me out a little bit to see income and numbers on any chart without location. And I noticed that locations were included in the memo. So I'm just gonna put that out there and I will sit back and wait. Thank you.
I appreciate you bringing that up, Shannon. That is a really important, I believe, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, we've talked about this before, the sort of fair housing implications and segregation implications. Got it. So if we're thinking about the questions on the table about how to make this translation, the mock-ups that have been provided, when you look at that and you think about housing types, and remember the statute has a whole bunch of types, and we've talked about some other types, it's structures as well as certain housing that's meant to serve specific people. What format should these housing production targets be translated into types? How does that work? And then, in lieu of a comprehensive or universally available data, sort of fact basis for some of these translations, how else should jurisdictions determine which housing types they need most? Anyone like to kick that off? Thoughts on housing types? Concerns you had when you read the mock-up? Yeah, Brock, go ahead.
Personally, I would think probably saying percentage of units instead of specific numbers, just because, especially considering that cities are going to be doing this for the very first time in coming years, I think it would be concerning to have a specific number and then realize, oh, that's not what we're going to hit. And, you can still build something in that affordability range, but maybe not that type. And so it's a little bit more experimental. So I would say a percentage and maybe like a margin of error or like buffer number.
Okay, thank you. Alan?
I'm going to speak to types here, and I'm looking specifically at the lowest income levels here, and the fact that we're starting with SROs, which is an imperfect unit type already. And so we're basically showing something that in my agency here at Northwest Pilot Project, there's literally a sign in the executive director's office that says, say no to SROs, because it's taking away person-centered choices in how they live, right? A studio will at least give you a place to eat and a place to use the bathroom within your unit. But to lead with SROs as the solution at the lowest income levels is basically saying we're taking an imperfect solution and we're putting that forward as a first option for the work we're doing. And I've got concern from the organizational perspective of that pushback. So I'd say on the type side, that's the most important piece I'd like to kind of throw out here. But there's some characteristic related stuff, and I'm not sure if we're here yet.
Hold on to that. I'd like to just sort of work through the types first, and then I realize this is a false sort of scenario, but because they all come together. But if you can hang on, that would be great. Okay, thank you. Great. Samantha, hi, glad you're here.
Right. I guess if I'm behind and this has already been kind of fleshed out, and if I need to do like a one-on-one conversation outside the group, I'm happy to do that. But I think I'm just slightly concerned when I see this granular of detail and numbers of how a jurisdiction is going to do any of this when they don't build housing. And the types of housing oftentimes come down to the economics of a specific site and a specific project, and things ebb and flow because money does not grow on trees, unfortunately. And so I guess I'm a little bit concerned or confused about how a lot of this is actionable.
We hear you. That's why it's on
Okay,
the
cool.
table
That
to
hasn't been figured out yet.
explore.
That makes
It's
me feel
not been
better.
figured out. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Celestina, if you want to add some more to that.
Yeah, the only piece that I think maybe is worth clarifying is that the purpose of the translation is to have something that the jurisdiction is planning for. So in selecting the housing production strategies, which would be the next step, what types of housing, what characteristics of housing, and what locations of all of that housing are those strategies aiming for? Because at the moment, the housing production targets will be units by affordability only. So it's not, it's less, we're trying to get at something that is more contextualized to aim for in the strategies. But the question about what that actually looks like in terms of a mix or percentages or number of units, that is definitely what we're here to unpack and figure out how we might tackle that.
Okay, I have one more quick technical question. Sorry, and then looking at these numbers, how much of how is existing stock like factored into that? Because I think of like SROs, so many existing units are converted into SROs. So how do jurisdictions consider what their existing stock is when looking at those numbers?
Great question. Go ahead.
Yeah, the targets are for net new units.
Okay.
So that's what the targets are for, yeah. And then in terms of how those numbers were established and how existing stock was considered, that would be a methodology question, which we'd have to put in a different room. In terms of how a jurisdiction knows what their existing stock is and to inform this process, that's a question that we also have. And as I'm sure you know, there is imperfect information about trying to figure out what a jurisdiction's existing stock is.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Mary Kyle, good morning.
Hi, there's a lot in this question, and so this is
Yes.
just a couple of questions and thoughts. One, I think it would be really helpful to have this framed in the information that cities will be getting from the state, from DAS and Oregon Housing and Community Services, as to the housing needs by income, over the next 20 years, as well as the socioeconomic profiles of those housing units, the age, household size, head of household, etc. Because then for some of that, I think it's easier to translate into housing types than for others. So for example, there are parts of the state that are a far higher percentage of people over the age of 70 and living by themselves. And others parts of the state have a higher percentage of families with children. And so I think that's critical information for cities to have to be able to link those, but I don't want to overemphasize. So I think in some cases, it may be easier to tie housing types to population projections, but not necessarily as discreetly as these charts maybe imply. So I also tend to go towards percentages, not numbers of housing types, because they're not discrete. It's not these things line up exactly with this or with that. But also we know that it is easier to deliver a product for moderate and lower income Oregonians that's attached from middle housing through apartment buildings that don't require elevators. So having those options really throughout a city and actually encouraged or even limited to certain, I don't mean limited to, but requiring certain places, especially those that we want to be walkable, mixed use, to allow just those types. So you couldn't build, for example, in metro, you can't build single family housing in multifamily zones. Something along those lines. It definitely recognizes that there are certain areas that are those more compact, mixed use, walkable neighborhoods. But there's a lot in the questions you asked us. I just
Yes.
dumped a lot, and I think I better stop because
We could keep going.
oh,
Yes.
and I should say, it seems to me that also for some things, and what Samantha said, there may be some things that I'm sure there are some things that cities know about their current housing stock, and there's a lot they don't know, and especially on accessibility. And so knowing those needs going forward is one thing, but let's just recognize we don't need to have perfect information to know we are way under serving those with accessibility needs, right? So building some percentages in, I don't know, there's experts here on that, but recognizing that we have past inadequacies to make up for going forward without being perfect in those numbers.
Thank you, Mary Kyle. Really appreciate that. And I saw quite a few nodding heads there. I see 3 hands up. I'm going to take them to talk about types, and then I'm going to move us on. So Brianne, please go ahead.
Thank you. I agree with Mary Kyle McCurdy that having that demographic information would be extremely helpful in making the translations on a local level. It's something we already do, but having additional, more granular data on that would be really helpful. And then I'd just say overall, I would support the percentage approach over the specific numbers. And then, sorry if I missed this, and this is something we talked about last week, I was out, but in general, I guess it gives me a little bit of concern to see the granularity of the different unit types. And I would caution to go down to that level of granularity. I would like to, I guess, it seems like it would make more sense to take it up a level and better categorize it as kind of what we call single unit detached, not single family detached, middle housing, and then define what that middle housing is, and then multifamily and define what those multifamily units are, and that let individual jurisdictions kind of determine what that is, provide guidance, specify what those unit types are, but then provide guidance. It would allow a lot more flexibility on the ground for what would pencil and what would make sense for different communities. Getting in this level, the level of detail that's provided now, it may not be feasible for certain jurisdictions, and I fear we would then get no housing. So the roll up, I guess, to those categories would be helpful. And I know now those categories are single family, attached, multifamily, or townhomes, basically. So more clarity, I guess, on those categories would be very helpful.
Great. Thanks, Brianne. Appreciate that. Garland.
Hi, folks. I'm greeting from the Strong Towns National Gathering and the Congress for the New Urbanism in Cincinnati. So good afternoon. First, I want to push back on the villainization of SROs. I know that there's a certain PSU professor who likes to throw them under the bus, but I think that SROs are one of the few market rate affordable housing types that can be delivered, that can be a real alternative to homelessness and as well to subsidized affordable housing, because you can get that price point down so low in SROs. You could maybe argue whether a social service organization should be making it part of their mission to provide SROs, or whether that should be more of a market rate type of housing. But there's several organizations now that are leaning into more middle and high end SROs now to meet the demand for shared living that is emerging amongst the next generation. So be very careful about victimizing any type of housing, whether that's single family homes or SROs. Like, we need all types as part of our solution. But getting into the real specificity of housing types and, what does it mean? What would it mean for a city to have a target to produce certain number or a certain percentage of SROs or townhomes or specific housing types, and how would you deliver that? I think you need to think outside the box, right? We're in a crisis, and the same type of thinking that got us into this crisis is not the same type of thinking that's going to get out of us. So if you're a local city and you're thinking about, well, how have I done my planning processes for the past 30 years? That maybe isn't the template for how you need to be doing your planning processes for the next 30 years to get us out of the crisis. So one way that a city might be able to achieve its targets, say, all right, here's our target, and we're going to make sure that we've zoned the city for 5 times this target for each of these capacities. So if we need to have 300 SROs, we make sure that we have enough zones that are zoned to allow SROs that you could build 5 times that in the city and still have it be within your capacity. That's one thing, is to have a relationship between the zone capacity and the targets where you've got more than enough zone capacity for those targets to be achieved within your city. But another is for the city to actually put some skin in the game. You know, the city could go out there and start doing special assessments and provide financing for up to that number of housing types that is paid back on the property tax bill. The city could go out there and co-sign loans for any developer that wants to go out there and deliver those particular housing types. If it's a housing type that's not otherwise being provided by the market, the city could get involved and help produce these housing types in a way that doesn't actually impact the city general fund budget, but does involve the city putting some skin in the game. So let's put on thinking caps. Let's think outside the box. Let's not think, what did we do last year? How can we make sure the state doesn't tell us to do something beyond that next year? But how can we actually solve this problem? What's going to work?
Thank you, Garland. Appreciate that. Appreciate you being here when you're out of town. Hi, Nathan. Glad you're here.
Hi, I'll be very brief. I agree with a lot of what was just said from Brianne and Garland and others. I think we should be very cautious about getting as granular as that table was. Housing development is mostly a market activity, and the market will decide what gets built. And we can try to nudge it in certain directions. But I would also agree with the point. I think the template that was shown, I did a quick math while it was up. I think it showed around 600 SROs in the hypothetical city of 25,000-ish from the ballpark. I would wager to say there's probably no city of 25,000 people in the state of Oregon that has anything remotely close to 600 SROs. Probably maybe none. But I don't think it should be made illegal or zoned out. So I agree with Garland on that point. I think we need all options. So in general, I think the role that the local jurisdiction can do is try to get out of the way and allow land use rules that allow developers to try different strategies to build different kinds of housing. The one thing I'll just say, though, about the 0 to 30%, market, which is obviously critical if we want to prevent homelessness, is even SROs built at scale are unlikely to pencil out financially unless there's a subsidy for 0 to 30%, an operating subsidy. It's just the math just isn't going to work because you're going to be charging such low rents, and even if you have a lot of units and you're at some sort of scale, it's just so. I just want to flag that if that's part of our goal here, like we really have to think about some state commitment for that low end of the market. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the reminder too, that there's well, 0 to 30 is very difficult. We all know that, but also there's this ongoing operating cost that makes that difficult. It's not just getting it built. Great. So I'm going to move us on to characteristics, same general set of questions. And Mary Kyle brought up one of the issues, which is sort of around accessibility as a potential characteristic of housing, needed housing, and sort of how would cities know what they need. And also knowing that we just know that everyone doesn't have enough, or that there's not enough in the state. So with that, I'll kick us off. There's also an additional question other than the sort of general format, safe harbors, evaluation for the translation. Are there characteristics that should be planned for and strategized towards specific affordability brackets? So that don't have to focus on that. I just want to point out that there is a additional question on there. So, what format should housing production targets be translated into characteristics? Are there some that fit certain affordability brackets? We could talk about safe harbors. We can talk about evaluation. Kathleen, I see your hand up, so I'm going to start with you, and then Brock, I'll get to you next. Go ahead, Kathleen.
I just wanted to point out to people that there was an article in the New York Times yesterday that talked about community funding housing, mixed use buildings, which is a way to begin to put together the money so you don't have to rely on the developers to kick off or determine what the housing looks like. So I would encourage people to take a look at that and to use that as something people should consider in terms of how the characteristics and types of housing can be accommodated.
Great. So alternative funding option or source is what I'm hearing. Yes, great. Thank you. Brock, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be short and simple on the second one. We know that we're very short on family-sized affordable units, so like 3-4 bedroom units at lower income ranges. Make sure we focus on that. The other one I would say is make sure that we're providing homeownership and affordable homeownership opportunities, particularly in the 80 to 120 range, where that's a little more market feasible. And obviously above that, which we've all seen throughout the course of history, but making sure that we have homeownership units that are available to people below median income is going to be a really important way to affirmatively further fair housing and accomplish restorative justice in this space.
Great. Thank you for those additions. Alan?
I'm going to resist the SRO conversation, but I want to.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I'm not saying to zone it out. Let's not lead with it and make that the best idea that's out there. Family size, to build on what Brock was saying, also is workforce housing, also is multi-generational housing. And so I think that there's a lot of pieces on those 3 to 4 bedrooms that are really helpful. I want to take a big step back on accessibility really quick, and kind of building on Mary Kyle's point earlier. We know we're woefully short. And so at all income levels, what can we do to remove staircases, steps from houses? That helps parents with strollers, cyclists, anybody who needs to get into and out of, entry and egress to their building. And so this, in my opinion, is the universal ask, except for when there's high grade, slopes, things that are prohibitive. But if we could start with the idea that a 0-step entrance helps everybody, and should be the standard for all we're doing, we then move to the biggest barrier for development of accessible housing, which is, what are we doing about bathrooms? Because bathrooms eat up floor space. They change the dynamics of the units. And that's where we need to have the tough question. What are we talking about when we're looking at turning radii inside of bathrooms? Are we looking at the full 360, a kind of T-turn? And that's where things really start to get, that's where development costs and unit size really start to get kind of impacted. I'd say that the visual and hearing related disabilities are a small part of what we're talking about. And so percentages make sense there, but leading with this idea of going for housing that is accessible for people who have physical disabilities, visual and audible, conflates those, puts them all together in some way. So 0-step entrances, good for everybody. Bathrooms are the sticking point. We need percentages to meet these other needs. So as I've told folks here on this call, I will be working with the indicators group starting, I think, next week. And so I'll kind of pour a little bit more into that. But big picture takeaways on the characteristics. And I'll add this too. I really love the idea about middle housing rather than just thinking about cottage clusters. So like in Portland, land divisions, homeowner or HOA kind of opportunities, thinking about the flexibility from an ADU to a cottage cluster and how those things will work. So not just putting all the eggs in the cottage cluster basket.
Great, thank you. Yeah, being more broad and thinking about what that middle housing is and what the options are. Rachel, hi, I'm glad you're here, and I heard you're going to pop off early today, so thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to raise that from the lender perspective, that when it comes to characteristics and even types, the more flexibility that's available, the better, because we're not always going to be able to find lenders who will lend in on certain types or characteristics. And just to be realistic with the what institutions are willing to lend into, we need to keep that in mind as we make these guidelines and rules. I do also want to just plug the Leading with Universal Design, and also want to say that in terms of flexibility, I think it's also really important to ensure that we do include flexibility in decision making on the local level, because if we are considering each community has a very different should have different goals in terms of restorative justice and just different equity goals. Different housing types and characteristics are also going to be different for, each individual community.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I appreciate that reflection on the sort of restorative justice being very context specific. And we also heard about just even structures, every community right now has a different sort of existing set of housing stock. So trying to figure out how that gets played in. Julia, please go ahead.
Yeah. So first I just wanted to lean in on one of the comments Alan was making, and I would definitely defer to him if I'm incorrect on this, but I just wanted to also layer in on the kind of audio visual component that's something that's pretty easy to add in after the fact in terms of just even simply like we had projects where that was even required, and the requirement could be met by providing outlets in the right place in order to put in an aftermarket like plug-in device. So I would encourage us to like contemplate what it actually means in terms of accommodating those needs and make sure that we're not getting too in the weeds around things like that really don't need to be overthought. And then, as Alan was saying, conflated with other, I think, more kind of complex and structural needs around physical accessibility. In terms of coupling certain characteristics with income levels, I would cautiously say yes, but encourage again to at the very least coordinate with, if not defer to, existing OHCS requirements around this. Not to say that all affordable housing is going to have OHCS funding in it, but I would venture a guess like nearly all of under 30% AMI projects would to some degree. And so again, no need to recreate the wheel. At the very least, it's really, really, really important with affordable housing because there's so many layers of requirements coming from the different layers of funding to make sure that then any well-intentioned land use based requirements or DLCD based requirements are not adding another paper cut to the death by 1,000 paper cuts, or worse yet, conflicting with requirements from funders. So I just want to reiterate, OHCS has an entire manual on characteristic requirements for developments for any project that uses OHCS funding. So I just really want to lift that up over and over and over again. And then also on the just generally a characteristic component, I do think it's important for there to be acknowledgement in some form around requiring certain characteristics, because obviously we're underproducing. That's why we're having this conversation. But I hesitate for there to be just a blanket requirement in terms of, numbers or tracking certain things, because I think who was just talking, I think this was kind of what she was getting at, was just remembering that certain demographic groups are not a monolith. So both across the state of Oregon and even within communities. And so there's some, that's where a little bit of that qualitative research comes in. That's where a little bit of that intersectionality acknowledgement comes in. So like the needs of folks transitioning out of homelessness might be really different in like Happy Valley than in LeGrand. Looking at your point in time counts, is there a higher level of mental health issues versus, physical ability needs, those types of things. And so just really, I think there needs to be kind of a finer connection point versus just a singular connection point. I think this is something where the safe harbor conversation could get really complicated because of that. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that.
Really quick, and then I see two hands up. I'll take those. The mock-ups had sort of the quantification like we did with types, but also this idea that maybe housing characteristics gets defined by magnitude of need. Maybe it's a high, medium, or low, or is that even too much? Or is it some sort of narrative that a city needs to provide that's not high, medium, and low? I don't know. Do you have thoughts on it? So I'm going to put you on the spot, Julia, since we were just talking about this.
No, it's fine. I've been floundering back and forth between this ever since I opened the memo on Monday. My gut instinct is still leaning towards like the high, medium, low. I think that could be fine. Like I think that that starts to get there in terms of at least acknowledging where the higher need is. I'm still struggling though to connect that to the accountability side of this, which I know we're not directly talking about in this tag, but it's just how do you say, yes, you did it to high, medium, and low? And so that's my only hesitation to that. But I do think that that is a good way to kind of thread the needle that I'm talking about in terms of the complexity of the nuance around housing characteristics for this one.
Thank you. Thank you for answering the question. And Garland, Samantha, and Shannon, I'll take your thoughts on this, and welcome to if you have additional thoughts about how it gets sort of characterized, the characteristics get characterized. All right, Garland, go please.
It sort of feels like I'm pushing back on my friend Alan twice in this meeting, so I'm not going to say I'm pushing back. What I want to say is I want to add some nuance to this zero-step conversation. We were just on a walking tour in Minneapolis and looking at all the great historic neighborhoods there. And one of the things that we noticed was that the homes that really felt like the most dignified, the homes that felt like they were the nicest homes, were those homes where they were raised up above the street. And usually what's done is you dig a basement, you take the spoils from the basement, you mount it around that, and it sets the home up off the street 3 or 4 feet. And it really creates a separation. And some folks talk about the need for 5 layers of separation between the private and the public realm, of creating the semi-public realm. And so what I want to say about zero-step entrances is that if you just make a flat site with a zero-step entrance, that your living quarters are on the same level as the street and the sidewalk, that's going to feel cheap, and it's going to result in a lower standard of living for those people on that floor. So when you want to think about creating a zero-step entrance, you want to think about working the topography. You want to think about how you're going to landscape that site to be able to set those living room units up off the street and work the topography to thread a ramp up to provide a zero-step entrance somewhere on the site. But when you hear about zero-step entrances, that should not mean every single entrance is at the same grade as the ground. That's also problematic in an era of increasing risk of extreme rain events. That you could get localized flooding if you don't properly elevate your units slightly above the yard. So there's a lot of reasons to think with a lot more nuance about how you design the topography of each individual site to be able to, yes, create zero-step opportunities, but also create dignified housing that looks like it's a place you want to live. And you know, just to back up Alan's point, why it is important to provide zero-step housing and units where you can roll in and out of every unit on every floor, and micro elevators and all those things are things we definitely need to be discussing. The generation with the most money, the generation with the most generational wealth right now are the baby boomers. This is a generation that's staring down one ankle twist from not being ambulatory any longer. You know, you have one bad game of golf, you step in one pothole, and all of a sudden you're on crutches or in a wheelchair. Do you really want to have stairs? And furthermore, if you're a developer, if you're trying to sell units in the market, do you really want to sort of like tell those buyers this unit's not for you, to the generation with the most means to buy into your product? So there's a lot of reasons why you want to do zero-step, but just think about the nuance.
Thanks, Garland. Appreciate the kind way you approach some counterpoints or sort of diversity of opinion. Samantha, Shannon, Mary Kyle, I'm going to take you, but I really want to move us along here. Samantha, go ahead.
So I really appreciate all of this conversation about accessibility and adaptability. It is one of the most important things we can be talking about, and I think it needs about probably its own separate work group, because the nuance here is very difficult, particularly when we are trying to couple or marry various objectives. What's best for on paper for accessibility might not make the most sense for affordability or density or any of those things. And there can be competing things when we look at build out. But my question is, some of the things we're talking about are definitely outside the scope of planning. And we're entering into code and structural code requirements that and this has been an outstanding question for me of when we're talking about these types of things. I mean, we're not in planning anymore. We're outside of the scope of goal 10. So how from a jurisdictional standpoint, like there are obviously many things we can do in the planning realm for assisting in planning for accessible units to be built, but some of the stuff is outside that scope. So does the department, is there, I guess, I don't know. How do we handle that when we're going outside of the realm of what's possible for planning?
I'm going to leave that question on the table, Samantha, and if we have time, we can circle back to that as well. Go ahead, Shannon.
Thanks. I just want to point to page 2 of the memo for today's conversation, where it says strategy selection and rules could provide safe harbor if certain set of minimum policies are adopted. I guess there's just something about the whole conversation so far that continues to make me very nervous, and that I don't hear anything about policies yet. So I haven't seen anything in these charts that show me a city should have safe harbor. I just want to say that on record, please. And so I just feel angsty that so much of this conversation is happening apart from any consideration of policies. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. And we will be getting to that part in section 2, but I appreciate that anxiety of separating the two topics. Totally get it. Mary Kyle, please go ahead.
That might reflect my still a little bit of confusion about how we're using high, medium, and low. I think it is supposed to reflect a level of urgency, but I hope it also is reflecting a level of going in the direction of more tools that ensure that a particular type of housing is likely to get built versus, its characteristics, locations, types. And I think that's the policies that Shannon's talking about too. So, okay, good, thumbs up. So, and if that's the case, yes. So yes, it's great if we allow middle housing through apartment buildings everywhere in a city, but we have to make sure that some things actually happen and get kind of a leg up. And those kinds of policies, I think that's what high means, but I'm still not sure. So that's it.
Fair enough. And yeah, the definition alone is not going to get us there. So it is that sort of follow-up what the definition speaks to. Andre, do you have something to add to that? And then I need to move us to locations.
The only thing I wanted to add is possibly talking about the fact that the law says that it's the whole city that's obligated to generate fair and affordable housing, needed housing that's fair and affordable. It's not exclusively one department, and this is something that we've talked about in prior discussions. So therefore, I would argue that it's not at all outside the scope of a housing production strategy or the team to involve the building department and the people who control building codes and so forth in that effort. Matter of fact, it's to be encouraged and included. So anyway, I just wanted to respond to that thing that was talked about earlier.
Thank you. And thank you for the reminder of, yes, the obligations to affirmatively further fair housing and get to these fair and equitable outcomes. And I feel and know we really want to talk about strategies because that's where the meat of that is. But can we, for just another few more minutes, talk about this definition of location and how that translation might be made with cities? Again, there's a sort of mock-up about how that could or might happen with the city, and just want to get your feedback on, again, quantification. I think I've heard quite a bit that quantifying, enumerating units by these type characteristic location doesn't feel quite right for many of you. I'd like to see if anyone wants to challenge that, or if high, medium, or low magnitude in this scenario of location as they've been sort of described here sort of gets us there. Again, this definition is being made in the HPS context for helping shape what cities might do for their strategies. Julia, please. And then Kathleen, I'll get to you next. Thank you.
I don't know if I'm jumping ahead on this topic, but I just wanted to again flag a couple of coordination things and a consideration. So just again flagging OHCS is currently working on revamping their funding process, which includes some location conversations. And related to that, I know that there's been some feedback to OHCS about what they're considering that I would also like to echo here. That I feel like with location in particular, I'd really avoid a black and white, you're in or out. Location is way more nuanced than that. I think it's very risky to be like, if you're across the street from where this line is drawn, you're not good enough. Or if you're like 0.26 miles away from a school, that's not good enough when we're saying that you had to be within a quarter of a mile. So I tend to lean towards things like a scoring heat map type thing where you're kind of like, you know, compiling all the good, the bad, good is positive, bad is negative in a heat map. And then basically within that kind of contemplating like a range of, yeah, this is a good mix of locations or a good, you know, siting for these types of things. So again, just want to prompt, you know, some thought to coordinate with our partners at OHCS on this to make sure we're not creating conflict, to make sure that we're being considerate of, I think to me, I have a personal focus on making sure affordable housing is being really considered in the location component, which I know Shannon brought up as well. Since it is very easy to stick affordable housing out where the cheap land is, and that land is cheap for a reason most of the time. So those that just, again, coordination, not black and white, give some buffer, those types of things.
Appreciate that. It is a really location is much more complex than it sounds, right? There are these elements, there's the environmental justice, there's potentially restorative justice, and then integration, segregation. Go ahead, Kathleen, please. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I would again bring up the racial equity issue. I think we need to have those units in this city and the urban core. So you've got the transportation, you've got the utilities, you've got the services, and those, so that those have to be at least in part located downtown and not out in the perimeter. The other thing I would urge is the location of group homes and group facilities for people with mental disabilities need to be incorporated in the city as well, rather than being outside where the services are and where people can participate in the life around them. And the law protects that. The Fair Housing Act makes it explicit that that's where you can locate those homes and facilities.
Thank you. Really good points on that. And even more additional elements to location. Go ahead, Garland.
Yeah, you know, thanks, Andre, for confirming my suspicion that these statewide goals apply to more than just the planning department. They apply to the whole city, right? And I think this is an important point that often gets lost on other departments. I think many of our cities, especially Portland, are very, very siloed in terms of their departments. And, you know, the transportation department may not think that the goals apply to them. They may think that's planning's problem. But if you need a plan for complete neighborhoods, if you need a plan for building out a sidewalk network so that your affordable housing residents aren't forced into automobile dependency simply by the fact that the city's chosen to not provide a sidewalk network, the transportation department's accountable for that, and they need to understand that they're also bound by those goals. And so we really need to take a whole of government approach to achieving these goals. Each city needs to think about taking a whole of government approach. The mayor and city council needs to understand that these goals apply to the entire organization. And it's not just something they tell their planning director to figure out and fix, but that everyone needs to play a part in delivering these solutions. And those departments that think it doesn't need to apply to them, they need to be held accountable.
Thank you, Garland. Appreciate that. Brock.
I want to bring this to the concentrated areas of affluence and poverty question, right? if we're saying don't build affordable housing out on the periphery where land is cheap, right? Put people in urban centers, that's taking away choice, and that's reinforcing existing patterns of segregation. Build all of it everywhere, right? That is what we're supposed to be doing here. We need to build all housing types, and we're trying to deconcentrate areas of economic inequality, right? If we're just saying build affordable housing in one spot, that is not doing that. The other thing I would say is that if we are doing that, right, a lot of that's going to need to be subsidized. Unless that comes from the state, that funding is going to come from the local government, which comes from property tax, which they then have to increase, which, puts pressure on every other housing unit in the area. So if you need to subsidize something that's more expensive in the very urban core, right, and the only way that you're going to be able to do that is by increasing local revenue, then you're increasing other overhead costs, which, and again, we're talking about building affordable housing. We're not addressing the whole cost of living, but it does play into that, right? And you're going to have, higher tax bills, which means you have less money to be able to invest in your kids, buy school supplies, or, whatever you're spending your money on, right? You're not going to have that choice as much if we're requiring subsidization by putting things just where the land is more expensive.
Yeah, a web of trade-offs in there that just keeps sort of growing. Shannon, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Okay, I'm ready. What I'm looking for is for DLCD to be really proactive in helping cities to reframe this whole conversation in the housing production plans. So I'm just going to make a bold statement. The healthiest, thriving communities are mixed income. What are cities doing to achieve healthy and thriving mixed income communities? On undeveloped land, on currently developed high affluence areas, on concentrations of less affluence, but maybe where there's quite a bit of home ownership and there's a high risk of displacement, right? So it's nuanced, it's context specific, but the goal is you don't displace everyone who's lower income because the goal is healthy, thriving, mixed income communities. That's the goal. Like, we're going to be a little prescriptive about the goal because it's really the goal. There's not a secret other goal. That's the goal in all the places. Healthy, thriving, mixed income communities. It's pretty simple, actually. The thing that's not simple is that it's hard. It's hard. And getting all the incentives and all the subsidy that we're going to need to actually build these homes in the state of Oregon, in Independence, Oregon, in Beaverton, Oregon, in Sutherland, in all the places, our Oregon cities and counties are going to have to be highly competitive. We are going to have to be rock stars at attracting federal funding from all the places. And it's hard and it's time intensive. And so DLCD is here, I think, newly funded by our state to help cities level up and be as competitive as they can. So like, this isn't like you automatically are going to get all the things you apply for, just as we as nonprofits don't get every grant we apply for. Darn it, we don't. But you got to be competitive. Like, you got to have a plan to enter the race in the first place. So this is where it's like, these are the things I want to see. What is the city doing to be in the race, to be competitive, to attract the state funding, the federal funding, to work with the county, to walk alongside for-profit and nonprofit developers? And this is part of why in earlier meetings, because we're really trying to create thriving mixed income communities, inclusionary housing incentives are also key and completely within a city's control. Completely within a city's control, right? So let's see cities doing those competitive things that are going to help attract the resources actually needed, and also forcibly structure some collaboration among developers to actually achieve mixed income communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. I saw some thumbs up and even a heart along the way there and nodding heads. I really appreciate that. Alan, something to add?
Yeah, I actually don't need to add much more because Shannon said it very perfectly. I really appreciate that. I did want to point out that I think what we're seeing in the mock translation piece there isn't a prescription, but it's a prescription for a certain context in that mock translation. And so I think, as Shannon said, context I think is super important here. And then I think the prescription comes after that. And I think that's what we're seeing in the example here. So I'm not sure, that might be misleading for some folks.
Samantha, I'm going to take you last for locations, and then I'm going to move us on to really focusing on those strategies, but please go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say that I disagree and agree with Shannon, where I disagree with Shannon and that I don't think that was a bold statement. I think that that was as it is, and I think that that is, at this point, it should not be a bold statement. That should be a well-accepted understanding of that's the point of this program, and where or sorry, that's where I agreed with Shannon. I'm not sure at this point, but where I was going to say that I actually don't think it is that hard. I think if local jurisdictions embrace the true point of this program, if we are all on the same page that this is about making vibrant, mixed-use communities, and that they are willing to collaborate with developers in their communities and then adjust their codes and regulations accordingly, the cities that do that will rise to the top, and the cities that do not will not. Obviously, there's going to be some barriers in terms of resources and things like that, but I think that it's a matter of shared goals and being willing to change. But I think that once this program rolls out, we're gonna be able to see where that's gonna be easier for others, but I think it's not going to be that hard for some.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective, and yes, grounding us some more on that. Alan, last word on this.
I just wanted to clarify, because Sam, you used the term mixed use and Shannon used the term mixed income, and I just want to make sure the agreement was
mixed income.
Perfect.
I mean, I like mixed use too, but I don't deregulate it all. But I know that's a different work group, probably.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. I heard that too, and I should have clarified that. Great. Thank you all. I know there are more thoughts on this. I know that there are some local jurisdictions on this committee I didn't hear from yet. So it might be that you're shy, it might be that you're still forming those thoughts, but we definitely want to hear them, and we can, Madi will line you out after this meeting about how to provide some more feedback. So moving us along to strategy selection in this context of translation. So I am going to hand it to, I think, either Madi or Celestina. I'm sorry, I don't remember who. Madi, great, thank you.
Let me share my screen real quick. Okay, does everyone see the Miro board okay? I see thumbs up, good. Well, thank you everyone for that part 1 discussion. Super robust, and it has me very excited for the 3rd topic area that is part of our NAPTAP. We won't get into that yet, but I can already know that folks will that will be extra fun beyond all the fun we've been having. That's where we get to develop the pro housing, the best strategies that will be helpful to local governments. So excited about that. Before that, though, we have this step here, which is, now that we've talked about part 1, we've talked about part 1 and part 2 of that 3-step process that was laid out in the discussion memo from 2 weeks ago. You know, local governments received their allocation, they contextualized it, they developed a translation. We just talked about that translation. Now they go into this important piece, which some of you all raised, is what to do with the identified need, what to do with the additional information that was gleaned from the contextualization in part 1 and part 2. And that is moving, local governments then move into the development of housing production strategies in their work in developing the HPS report. And so so we're not going to focus on the strategies themselves in this discussion. We're going to, let me zoom in a little bit. I see, does that look better? Okay. Thank you for letting me know it's too small. Now we're going to move away from, or we're not going to focus the discussion on the strategies. We're going to do that in late 2024. What we're going to focus on is how to support, or the opportunity that we have right now through this rulemaking, which is, is there an opportunity for DLCD to offer support in the format for how local governments choose their specific strategies? And so in the discussion memo, we outline 4 options, just to, they're not the options, they're just 4 options for you all to grapple with. And if these aren't the right, then we also want to hear that and see what would be the right way to assist local governments in the option, in the format or the process by which they should consider the development of their strategies. The first one here is one that an option that came out of the development of the ONA legislative recommendation. So think back to 2022. This recommendation report is what led to the development of the ONA policy, HB 2001 in 2023. And here, the project team put on the table a sort of fair housing framework that could be helpful in kind of supporting local governments in how to develop strategies. And the intent here is, and this doesn't have to be the matrix or the graph, but it's a option of how to think about it from a fair housing lens, where you see housing production on the vertical axis and population diversity on the lower axis. And really this is, how does your community look like? Areas of affluence versus maybe more diversity, and then how the levels of production in a community. And so this framework then we could consider, putting local governments on this framework and seeing where they are in the axes, and that could be a potential guidance for the specific strategies that could be helpful in responding to fair housing issues based on this particular framework. And of course, this could be modified, but maybe this is an option that could be helpful. And I would love to hear if that seems to land for anyone, or maybe this isn't the right way. The next option here is to go back to the equity indicators and maybe develop scenarios based on those equity indicators. And as you might recall, these equity indicators are in a charge specifically for Oregon Housing and Community Services, and it's under development right now. But ORS 456. Oh. Do I hear an echo? ORS 456602 outlines exactly the possibilities of the housing equity indicators. And maybe based on this, does DLCD develop possible indicator pairings and that could kind of offer some scenarios of what could be existing in local governments, and then couple that with specific strategies? That's an option here for your consideration. Another option here is going back to the HPS menu of tools, actions, and policies. We've discussed this in previous meetings. This is a tool that currently exists, and I've heard from many of you, and you're not going to be able to see the text here. It's so small, but I can link you all to this if you want after here. But this would essentially be maybe additional tagging could be added to the menu, and tagging could include, this fair housing issue could be addressed with these particular strategies, as an example. That is something that can happen, and our discussion today in terms of format. And then lastly here is a question of, is there a set of possible pro housing or the top most effective ways to achieve housing production, housing affordability, and housing choice? And if so, maybe the development of these top strategies could occur. And of course, layering in, is there a safe harbor opportunity with this particular piece? So that is kind of just 4 options for consideration in terms of how to support local governments in going from step 1, step 2 to step 3, and really developing strategies that respond to the fair housing issue areas, to respond to their needed housing that they would have gleaned from steps 1 and 2. I think with that, I will turn it back over to you, Deb. I'm going to post the questions in the chat as I did earlier, and I am looking forward to hearing from you all.
Great. Thank you so much, Mari. And just a reminder, we're having this discussion because we've heard from you and others that this process of strategy selection for cities who have been through their HPS, it's just sort of undefined how they go about this. And there's been a request to try to figure out how do we offer, we being the grand we, how does the state offer more guidance, or does the state offer more guidance to cities about which strategies might go with which needed housing elements or which fair housing issues or both. So Julia, please go ahead.
I just actually wanted to ask a quick clarifying question for staff. So assume, but I want to make sure I'm correct in my assumption that this conversation could be a yes and not an either or, right?
That these, yeah, Celestina or Mari.
Like it's not just a particular, like one of these tools is what you're hoping that we choose.
I think we can do yes. Okay, sorry. It took me a little bit to make sure that I processed your question. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a one. I think it's important to consider, the pros and cons about all the options. And, I will say that the HPS menu specifically is an option that is always going to be developed and refined annually as needed, because it's a tool, it's a resource that is already exists, and definitely, as even I mentioned in that description about additional tagging, could be improved upon. So that could happen, and then maybe there's an additional option that could also happen to better support local governments, because that doesn't exist currently, and this is the opportunity in the rulemaking that we have to better define, the needs piece with the appropriate strategy selection. Is that helpful, Julia?
Yes, thank you.
And if I could just also add the question about how the rules are written in a sense of whether or not they include a safe harbor could differ between these approaches. Like the HPS menu already exists, like Mari said, that can and will be iterated. And so that could continue to live in guidance, or the tagging that's within the HPS menu could be referenced in rule in a way that it actually becomes that picking those strategies are actually more of a safe harbor option. So there's interplay with each of these. They could live in different ways in the program. And we're interested in hearing from you all how you think they might best live at which of them.
Nice. See Andre's hand up. I'm thinking you have something to add, please.
I do. Thank you. Maybe this is just another way to approach Julia's question. I think it's possible to layer these approaches. And so the first one that Mari showed really has to do with elements of your city's context. Where are you now? And are you racially diverse, or are you racially undiverse? That's not a word, but you know what I mean. And then on the other side, it's where are you currently in terms of housing production? Do you have a dead market without much happening, or do you have more of a dynamic market actually it's probably more where do you want to head rather than where you are now. A dynamic market versus a market that's more static. Anyway, so I mean, you could use that, and that leads to a certain range of tools that make some sense, but then you drill down further. And I'd like to suggest that there are two important reference points that make, at least in my mind, almost a set of goals. One we just talked about this earlier this morning, which is all your projections of needed housing by type, location, and characteristics. So those become kind of goals for you. The other place that you get goals, now you have to go in your Wayback Machine, is remember a few meetings ago, we talked about fair housing and fair housing, gosh, now I'm forgetting my word, but it's basically your fair housing needs, what your needs are by various kind of groups or categories, fair housing issue areas. Thank you so much, Deb.
Sorry, I was late.
No, that's okay. So, under each of those issue areas, hopefully you've developed some sort of summarizing statement which says, these are the barriers to fair housing choice that we found in our city. So you got to address those. You've got to address those as part of what you're doing. And some of them may be, it's not just producing housing, it's producing fair and equitable housing. So you may find some things on your list to ensure that the housing is fair and equitable that maybe have less to do with what the planning department might do with housing production and have more to do with ensuring that the housing is fair and equitable and removing those barriers to housing choice. So I'll stop there, and I've gone on for a long while. I'll just say one quick thing. An example might be, you are working with all these developers and so forth to generate needed housing. But what are you doing in terms of requirements around how that housing is marketed and who gets first shot at it? And, where's the greatest housing need? And maybe there's some things that you could do about requiring a fair housing marketing plan whenever the city provides incentives. So anyway, that's kind of a big deal. Thanks.
Great food for thought. Thank you. And appreciate this notion of layering. I'm also seeing the sort of layering between the fair housing framework, that quadrant map that was at the top that Madi showed, and then the equity indicators. There's some crossover between kind of data that one would use for either of those as well. So I think there is, thank you for the question, Julie. I think there is lots of opportunity for sort of mix and match or layering. Okay, Brock, you've been very patient. Go right ahead.
Sorry if you can hear sound outside. I think looking at this, right, the strategies aren't going to change depending on how we format it. But I think from that standpoint, the most comprehensive format would be that option 3 with the HPS menu. I think the universal set could be combined into that and just say like, hey, here's general strategies that we've seen work really well across the state. Right, we update those every X number of years, right, based on what people have done and whether or not those have been proven effective. But then having it as that menu of just kind of like, here's the equity indicators you might want to consider. Here's the fair housing issues you might want to consider. You could literally just build it in an Excel table. And that's going to be my really weedy comment, is that I would like to see these guidance materials. And again, these are for cities to use. And so I'd really love to hear your preference too. My initial thought would be have this actually like as an Excel document that you can download a copy of, and that way you can put in like different filters and stuff like that, so that they don't have to just like sit and sort through with a highlighter, and, but I think all of these could be combined conveniently in an Excel table that way.
Great, thank you. And I'm Mary Kyle, go ahead, but I see Tara, I'm glad you're in the mix here, but go ahead, Mary Kyle.
Thanks. I think always refining and then further tagging the HPS is kind of a no-brainer regardless. Tagging it for which tools are particularly effective at meeting different housing needs, getting into the policies that have been a little elusive. And And then I think how those are used, I see something that's in between what, now maybe it was Mari, I can't even remember who described it as between pick among the HPS and then have a safe harbor, which is a tool where, and this again may reflect on whether the particular type of housing needed falls into a high, medium, or low urgency of need. We know most of the housing that every city needs is going to be for those at and under 80% area median income, based on the numbers we have so far. That to me is a high urgency and that equitable and fair housing. So to me, that means providing menu from which cities pick amongst those tagged. If you particularly need certain types of housing and there's ones that are tagged along those lines, you really have to pick from amongst those. There's always the option to propose something in addition, but that's the starting point, is a menu that's been really tagged. As opposed for some maybe low urgency housing needs, it can be a little bit more wide open amongst the housing production strategies. So it just seems to me that high, medium, and low combined with the HPS and layering in the fair housing framework may mean a different level of constraint or constriction or direction to which tools a city must pick from, depending on the housing need. So not wide open, not super constrained, but some constriction around what have been shown to be most effective at meeting housing for those of X, Y, Z need.
Yeah, the most urgent needs, I heard you say too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Tara, hi.
Yeah, I wanted to build on some things that Andre was pointing out. You know, the outreach and community work that needs to be done with the HPS is really lovely at focusing on barriers not only to housing production, but to housing access, like she was saying. So is there discrimination based on English not being your first language? Are there credit barriers, what have you? So the conversation has been making me a little nervous today because the emphasis almost exclusively on housing production. So, you know, what I felt like I was really coached only to prioritize housing production in our HPS when there really is a need to combat the discrimination that comes along with certain people trying to access housing within the community, and also a need to preserve housing. So, for example, we know in Gresham there's a lot of properties, LIHTC properties, and their affordability requirements are expiring. So how can we work, for example, with Home Forward to go in and support them in making those properties continue at their affordability levels in order to support housing stabilization and preservation. So, you know, I really just want to emphasize this is called a housing production strategy. I really don't like that name because it's not just about production. It's much bigger than that. And so if we can really make sure that we're talking about housing production in a really multifaceted way, also preservation, also equity programs, and that is in our prioritization and in the strategies, I think that's going to be critical. Also, I love the example of the tags, really appreciate it. I think that'd be very helpful. I also like the first example that was given that Mari showed. I think that can be helpful, that sort of scale there, but not only housing production preservation. We have to figure out how to build in other community-based programs, which I do think go along with your restorative justice model into how we're figuring out that strategy and that prioritization. Also, just the reality or my reality of a housing production strategy was that it took 2 years to create a 139-page report. So our consultant gave us 170 pages, which I went and tried to take out all the redundancies. I was able to cut down 30 pages to try and make it a little bit more readable. And I was told that I couldn't cut any further because everything in there was exactly what DLCD was requiring, going to be checking off. So I have a dream that staff could have like a 20-page template of everything you need, and with your strategies and with your suggestions in that template, and we can make it really easy for us, making sure that we get exactly what we need. And so we could focus on the outreach, we could focus on the analysis, we can focus on the ground work, and then just put the core things in that easily accessible document that maybe is only 20 pages. And then if a jurisdiction wants to throw out your template and do their own, justifying the exact same thing, great, they could. But, you know, a guide like that that would help us alleviate some of that process. So we don't have 3 staff and a 3-person consultant team working for 2 years to create a long document with 5 indexes would be helpful at the local level, just to be very practical.
Thank you, Tara. Really appreciate that. I saw some nodding heads and thumbs up with the desire to figure out how to reduce that burden. And just word of caution as we're talking about these new processes for translation of needed housing, et cetera. So I really appreciate that. Julia, please go ahead.
So yeah, I just wanted to throw out some appreciation for what Tara was talking about too, in terms of that this goes beyond just production. There's so many barriers to accessing housing. And as I've been reviewing a lot of the HPSs that have been adopted today, I've been really pleasantly surprised at the efforts to acknowledge that within some of the strategies as well. And so I think Tara had brought this up either in the last meeting or in one of the RAC meetings, just, some encouragement to DLCD, I think, to relay that framing to their consultants as well, to make sure that it's not just getting boxed into solely the only thing we're focusing on is new housing. We're focusing on like access to housing and preserving housing and all of that as well. Then I'm not going to go on too long about the HPS menu because I feel like I've talked about it in the last like 3 meetings I've been in. So I'll try and keep it brief because I'm pretty sure y'all know I'm a fan of using it. I also just wanted to layer in, related to what Tara was saying, in some conversations I've had with cities about utilizing that list as well. There definitely is, I think, some interest in being able to leverage that list as within, some flexibility, almost a checklist to minimize, that work that is going into these massive documents. And again, as someone who's been trying to review them to educate myself, to understand strategies that cities are doing, looking for best practices, I'd imagine you as DLCD staff would also like to not be reviewing 100-page documents. And so I think that there's kind of a win-win to trying to both simplify how we're connecting these dots that we're talking about by coding. The upfront work would be really heavy. I understand that there'd be a lot of work to keep it up to date. But I think the long-term benefits of having a really solid live spreadsheet resource in that HPS would benefit everyone in terms of peer learning, in terms of review processes, in terms of being able to have a bit more of an apples to apples comparison on the accountability side. And then with that transitioning to kind of the safe harbors conversation, I also think that then could act as a way to have kind of an iterative process to be updating what DLCD considers as safe harbors by way of looking at what is proving to be successful from that list. And so, after the first, 8 years or something, DLCD could be like, okay, in rural jurisdictions that have a tourist economy, these 3 strategies seem to be really consistently used and really consistently tied to success in, housing production. Let's make that our safe harbors for those types of things. And so I think that there's just some good, again, iterative components that could come out of that. On the front end of safe harbors, so kind of, as we're kicking off this process, I am a fan of having those. I'm still hesitant to know if we have all of the knowledge and understanding to really put together a truly effective like safe harbor concept just yet. I think we're in the kind of like learning stages still. That being said, I think Garland, not to steal your thunder because I see your hand up, but I think Garland has brought this up a couple of times, and I'm really curious to kind of lean into it a little bit more of maybe part of the strategy is setting up those safe harbors so that they're a little exaggerated, so that there's kind of room for error. So if they're not quite as successful as we hope they are, there's still some success. With that, I think there's a balance point of ensuring any safe harbors that are set up, that they be a bit ambitious, but not so ambitious that no one chooses them. So I think there's a little bit of a tension in that, especially again on this front end of the process where we don't necessarily have like hard outcomes for every single strategy. But I just want to kind of flag that as I think an interesting way to leverage the safe harbors at this stage in the game.
Thank you for that, Julie. I really appreciate it and appreciate the additional detail on the sort of what would help to make that menu perform better. You're not alone in that request, so that's been bubbling up quite a bit. Garland, please go ahead.
So I just want to tell a quick little story to give some hope, because I sense that there's a lot of anxiety in this virtual room right now, and people are questioning, like, essentially, are we going to be successful at this? Can we design something that can succeed? Yesterday, I was in this neighborhood of South Chicago called Pullman. Pullman was a neighborhood that was built in the 1880s, so it's 140 years old. Pullman's a mixed neighborhood, and it has a large number of 15-foot wide townhomes. 15-foot wide townhomes, some architects will tell you can't do that. Here's this neighborhood to prove that you can. That's also the concept behind the Grow Home. This is not a book about growing cannabis, although if you Google that, that's what's going to come up. It's a book by a Canadian author about 14 to 15-foot wide townhomes, and just how dramatically effective they can be at causing permanent affordability. So the Pullman neighborhood of Chicago is the most diverse neighborhood, the most mixed income neighborhood of Chicago. Most Chicago is actually very segregated, but Pullman is about 1/3 Black, 1/3 Hispanic, and 1/3 white, with a large mix of income. So it's the most diverse, most harmonious neighborhood of Chicago. And it's those 15-foot wide townhomes that have been delivering that diversity and that affordability consistently without subsidy for about 140 years. So if you have hesitations about can we do this? Can we be successful? Trust that if you design for permanent affordability and you do it right, it will work. And we have a number of examples of this from the eastern half of this country, of places that have been delivering affordability very consistently, decade in and decade out. So it's about designing the right program. Also, look at the flip side of the coin. Single-family neighborhoods that have been designed to create economic exclusion have been consistently delivering economic exclusion decade in and decade out. So if things do work as designed, the question is, what are you designing?
Thank you, Garland, and thank you for the additional sense of hope so we don't get too drawn down in the deep darkness. I see 2 hands up. I also just want to point out or sort of open up and make sure there's space for a couple of you we've not heard from. Michael and Ariel, you have sort of jurisdictional perspective on this. I'd love to hear sort of any sort of angst or hope you have. And Kim, I'm really curious if you have any thoughts about additional thoughts from last time, but also on either needed housing and strategy selection, and sort of from the community side of things, what would be helpful if there's some types of safe harbors that would be constructive. If you all feel like it and you have some thoughts, we would love to hear those. So I'm going to leave that there. Shannon and Alan, though, first.
Just a thought around the safe harbors, kind of building on what Julia shared earlier about feeling like in a way we're early in the process to be creating those. I wonder if safe harbors sunset, right? So maybe they don't last as long as the housing production plan, and there's like a 3-year check-in. That just seems intuitive to lead to me like a really good idea. Thanks.
That is an interesting idea. I think we can play that out anyway and sort of think through how that would work. Thank you for that. Alan, please.
I want to highlight the difficulty in matching the language that's being used here and the language that's being used in the broader world of accessible housing. And I know this has been brought to the attention of DLCD staff in the past, but when I'm looking at the page 39 from the ONA Legislative Recommendations Report, I see accessibility several times, and there's not a single meaning here related to accessible housing. And when we covered fair housing, we talked about it from the access perspective. And in the rest of the ONA legislative recommendations, we're not using the term accessibility. And so this is a problem in that we're now using the term accessibility to talk about things that are not accessible housing from that specific perspective. And so it's a hard conversation to have. And similarly, the term safe harbors, Safe harbors is used in the term in the concept of accessibility, physical accessibility in housing, to talk about how the Oregon Structural Specialty Code aligns with the ICC and other strings attached, like 504 compliance or Oregon Revised Statute 556.510, which was a visitability requirement. And so safe harbors in this world that we're living in with accessible housing is very difficult, but it's clearly defined in the code. Are we talking about safe harbors as they exist to accessible housing, or are we talking about safe harbors that are something else? And so we're using these terms that are already used in this field of accessible housing design and development and code, and starting to make them into other things. And the term accessibility in particular is the most difficult one. And that example is perfect. When we're looking at figure 5, we're not talking about accessible housing. We're talking about something else that's access to a place, a program, opportunity. And so if we could stop talking about accessibility when we're meaning access in the fair housing world, that'll help us a lot more to say, okay, now we're here in the physical accessible housing space, or the accessibility to programs for people with disabilities. And this is the most it's come to a head. I've been hearing this from partners in this space. And then I'll just say, with the safe harbors piece, I'm happy to dig deeper and to give some guidance and direction there. But safe harbors and physical accessibility is a very specific thing. But I think we're talking about something more broad than that. So I'm a little confused. But anyways, it's a language thing.
Yes, Alan, thank you for that. And I know this issue of how the term accessibility is being used also came up in the last RAC meeting. And so there's we're trying to make sure we're using it in the most proper sense. And so there might be some older documents that haven't been updated that way, but I think we have to be careful. Alan, I'm hoping you have some light to shed or thoughts about, I'm guessing, safe harbor or accessibility.
Well, it's just a follow-up on Alan's offer around, because there was discussion in crafting legislation about how we include something specific about accessibility, and there were some real roadblocks that we ran into in exactly how to define it. So I appreciate that you might have a solution to that, because I think there was actually an effort to include the ICC in the legislation, but when we were told that it couldn't be because it was an international standard rather than a state standard. So it sounds like there's a connection somewhere else in code. And so, yeah, I think if that's something that can get to the proper channels, it would be very helpful.
I'll forward over a document that I'd worked on at the City of Portland that connects to the Oregon Structural Specialty Code that the Bureau of Development Services helped us with. And that might help in understanding where those touch points are. Yeah, and it may have been because it was the state level statute that may have tripped it up versus local. So, but appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And Mari, do you want to speak to the issue of safe harbor or accessibility?
I can. I was also going to remind Alan if we could use Della Torre, if we could use the formal communication when you send that over, so that we get it in that fashion. So thank you. And then you had another piece. What was the other piece here?
I was curious about, I think maybe you don't need to speak to it, but this issue of how we're using the term safe harbor. Safe harbor means things in other realms. It also has a specific meaning with the land use planning program as well. So I think there needs to be some reconciliation.
Yeah, I think maybe what I can offer for now, and again, we're happy to continue to unpack this wherever we need to or with whomever, but the safe harbor is not that tool in terms of program development or rule development exists in many, many places. And I think it's very understandable that it could get confusing about which safe harbor might we be talking about, but it's just a rule writing tool. So it absolutely makes sense that there's a safe harbor in terms of the Oregon Specialty Code and its relationship to the ICC code and what that means for this type of physical accessibility and the structural requirements for that unit. Absolutely makes sense to me that process has a safe harbor. And then in this different process, we're talking about this set of rules and this program and this pathway, and we might have a safe harbor here. And I don't have a harebrained example of some completely different program that might also have a safe harbor, but it's just a tool. And so we're thinking about using that tool in the rule writing, and unrelated to how that tool or what the tool actually is in any number of other types of programs.
Yeah, and I guess I'll add, if folks want to do one-on-one to kind of unpack that even further, we can totally do that. And we can, on our team, think about just the safe harbor options beyond that exist in the space that we're talking about in terms of the safe harbor. So that's also something we can consider to helpful to kind of let the, with understanding that particular piece and how we're using it here.
Thank you both. Maybe you all have figured this out by now. We are not going to get to part 3, the integration with housing capacity analysis. We will take a stab at that through the rule writing and probably come back and talk to you about that. And in the meantime, we will give you a way to give us some written feedback. Ariel, I saw you had your hand up. Would you like to say anything, or you have a question, or?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to appreciate that you called us out to include some comments. I mostly have been relying on nonverbal cues to sort of save space and time when I agree with other folks on the call. But I guess I just would like to reiterate some points that other folks have had. Like, I think generally from a staff perspective of needing to implement some of these, a safe harbor guidance in general, I think would help provide quicker and better results for cities. I also sort of think the universal strategies could be the aspiration, but sort of that option 3 of that menu with the greater detail of tags provides more assistance. You know, we relied on that through this last HPS process, but I also have a lot of thoughts on how that could be improved to make it easier, better as a tool for us. And similar to Tara, you know, like there are some things that could maybe make the process easier when doing that translation into the strategy part, you know, that might come up later, but.
That's great, Ariel. Thank you. And I know you have really fresh experience with it. So we would love to hear those sort of practical needs or ideas that cities have as you've worked through that. Garland.
I just want to say something about safe harbor. I think safe harbor is the right approach. I think it actually is the right terminology. The Southern California Association of Governments uses the term safe harbor when they issue, they have a memo that they've given to all their jurisdictions that provides a safe harbor for counting their ADU production in terms of meeting their regional housing needs analysis by income class. And so what they did is they did a survey of ADUs and they came up with a percentage mix. And so if a city says we built 100 ADUs, then they can take a safe harbor and they can use that percentage mix and they can say, well, ADUs in your county, you can just use our assumptions as a safe harbor. It's 40% this AMI group, it's 30% this AMI group, and it's 30% this AMI group. And so you don't have to do your own survey. You can just use our safe harbor assumptions, multiply it by your ADU production, and we will give you credit for production by those income classes. That's your safe harbor assumptions. I can give you that memo that SCAG produced. It's a good example of providing some safe harbor assumptions and guidance that allow you to map from a particular unit type to a particular income category without having to do all the homework jurisdiction by jurisdiction to make those quantitative connections.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts on oh boy, my brain is starting to faint. I'm seeing nodding heads, I'm not alone. Strategy selection, safe harbor, this idea of how how a city should go about sort of the format, or how DLCD can set up more certainty on the format. Okay. Oh, yes. Long pauses work sometimes. All right, Julia, please.
I just wanted to give space because I know I've been talking a lot. So I also wanted to layer in, because I don't think I mentioned this earlier, that in general, in terms of kind of the safe harbor side of things, I think I've mentioned in other meetings, I kind of like live in this in-between world of liking this idea of maybe the safe harbors being like a pick, 3 things off of this list, like not just like singular, this is it, this is the safe harbor path. And I think there is an importance to recognize that certain tactics will be significantly more impactful when coupled together. How that gets translated into a safe harbor framework, I do not know. I'm glad it's not my job. But I just want to acknowledge that I think there's, again, a little bit of tension there in terms of like some flexibility in a safe harbor option pathway, which I'm a fan of. And if people just like pick easy ones, maybe even intentionally to kind of get off the hook, and then nothing actually comes out of that, that's also a problem. So whatever that looks like, just want to throw that out there for consideration.
Yeah, the safe harbor needs to be impactful. And that's probably not just one. I don't think we know enough information to pick just one. Kim, hi, welcome.
Hi, thank you. In regards to safe harbor, even if I'm fine with that as a strategy, but I just wanted to say that even if a jurisdiction picks what we think will be impactful strategies, there's also the likelihood that it will not have the impact that we all hope and intended. And we need to recognize it's an iterative process. And I would hope that the state is committed to finding the resources to keep checking in and seeing, is this working? Are we getting the outcomes that we expected, and change course if needed?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I can't remember who, maybe it was Shannon that was saying maybe sort of a expiration date on safe harbors might be one way to make sure there's that check-in. Andre, thought to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that at this point, it's going to be really hard to come up with valid safe harbors. Simply because we haven't had enough time to figure out what works, and to be able to come up with something that is clearly justifiable is going to be extremely difficult. They're also if you use a statistical method to figure out which strategies are associated with the production of a lot of units, you could also end up with some things that just are things that cities tend to use that produce a bunch of units but aren't necessarily contributing to that production. So I, strongly encourage us to think carefully about it would be a great thing to be able to have safe harbors, but is it a realistic thing from the get-go? And maybe it's something to work towards, but not necessarily a place to start. Might be one possibility.
Thank you for the additional context. 2 hands up, and I'm going to go Brock and Michael, and then we're going to go into wrap up so we make sure we have time. Go ahead, Brock.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. In response to Andre's comment, thank you. That's actually something I was just going to say. I wonder if maybe having a delayed effective date for when safe harbor protections kick in might be effective. That way we can go through, a cycle and then say, okay, these are the ones that we've seen work. Now it's, those can be safe harbors. And in response to Kim's comment too, since we're going to be grouping cities into kind of like peer groups for, progress reviews and things like that, I wonder if at some points it might be helpful for DLCD, and this isn't something that we need to go and rule, but just kind of a general practice to host kind of like peer city roundtables and just say like, hey, here's, a handful of cities that are in a similar situation with regards to this. Every year or 2 years or something, people come in for half a day, sit down, talk strategies, see what worked, see what didn't, see how they can fix it, and just kind of, really collaborate in that way.
Great idea. I really like that. Thank you. One more opportunity to sort of learn from one another and elevate the things that are working. Michael, hi.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to chime in because I've been very quiet and partially frustrated in the background because I think the conversation as I'm kind of listening to it is from a very urban and city perspective and not a rural perspective. And I get the impression that a lot of the discussion revolves around ideas that are not consistent and not in touch with what rural communities face. And at least in Eastern Oregon, once you get further east of Bend and Prineville and the Dalles, and we don't consider them Eastern Oregon. But as you get east of that, a lot of communities don't have planners. My community is a planner of one, it's just me. And some communities don't have a planner, or they have a part-time contract planner. And so I think as we look at the different rules that we're talking about, I think they're great ideas and they're great goals that we all strive towards. And we're doing the best we can to actually achieve those. We've made a lot of code changes that are very beneficial to this conversation. But I think one of the realities we're looking at is the housing production strategy rule, just came into effect about 2 years ago. And there's no track record to even know if that works. And it's too new. And we're already talking about changing it. And so that's a frustration rural planners have is we're so thankful to get one house built, let alone now we're talking about multifamily and different income levels. And I think there needs to be a reality check of what can a population of 25 or 50,000 people do versus a population of 10,000. There's a completely different, development sentiment occurring and the reality. And I get really frustrated because a lot of these things are not realities for us. We're so thankful to get a duplex built that, trying to have measures that we have to try to live up to. We're all, at least in Eastern Oregon, we've got 5 planners that get together regularly, and we're already thinking that we're going to fail the system because we can't live up to the measures we've already been given. So.
Really, thank you, Michael, for having the bravery to step forward in this group and bring forward those needs of especially those cities that are around 10,000 or 10 to 25,000. It's very different context and very different levels of capacity to follow through with this work. So I appreciate that. Okay, as always, even though I promised Madi I'd give her 5 minutes to wrap up, we have 2, but we're going to make it work. First, I would like to just take a moment to reflect on our conversations as they relate to the racial equity framework. I think I'll just open it up and see if any of our subject matter experts have any thoughts on that, or I can fill in any thoughts. Go ahead, Alan.
Thanks, Deb. Yeah, I want to offer appreciations first to Michael. Michael, I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation. I agree with you, and I think it's something that's always that we would always like to keep top of mind, but it helps to have folks remind us about that, and us being LCDC and DLC together to make sure that we understand those perspectives. And then I think that's true for this process overall. When we go back to the racial equity framework, I appreciate and I really acknowledge that folks are thinking about the different protected classes with regard to fair housing, that it's underlying the conversation we're having. And I also recognize the hard work to actually connect those things to the rules that are going to come out. I will say, if you watched the last LCDC meeting, there was some information about how the department plans on making that connection, the process they will go through to capture what has been said here and how we'll connect eventually to the rules. And I do appreciate that work. And I think it's looking forward to having that conversation when we come back in July with rules and see how it connects back to the work that we've committed to do under racial equity. And with that, I'll pass it to Mari or to Andre because her hand came up.
Thanks. Just quickly, I think we sort of missed an opportunity to drill down on some racial equity things when we were talking about location. There was more of an opportunity there to talk about what access to community resources and environmental justice concerns that we didn't address. And the big one that we didn't really address is integration segregation as it pertains to race. And we tended to mostly instead talk about, center city versus areas at the fringe. And I think the overall discussion is much broader than that. So hey guys, this is our opportunity in the next week to add comments and so forth about those things and how to tie them in.
Thank you. Thank you for the honest reflection, both Alan and Andre. I really appreciate that. Mari, where are we going from here, please?
Yeah, thank you all for sticking around. I'll make it really quick. And Andre already took one of my points, which is, as usual, I will be sending a communication out following this meeting to you all for that opportunity to continue to add anything that you didn't get to in the space or it occurred to you afterwards to the Miro board. So definitely encourage you all to engage with that Miro board. Next, I'll say today was the last NAPTAC meeting before a break period. So the month of June, staff will be taking that full month to develop rules based on all of the discussions that we've been having since the beginning of the NAPTAC process, which initiated back in March. We'll next see you in a joint TAC meeting with the HOTAC on July 24th from 10 to noon. That is the opportunity that staff will come together, HOTAC and NAPTAC, so Celestina, myself, Sean, and Thea, to offer you, to overview the draft rules. From there, we'll shift conversation about continuing to refine those draft rules based on our individualized scope within each TAC. And that will happen through September. And then other notes worthy of kind of flagging to you all in terms of other meetings. So RAC meeting 4 is next week. If some of you are on the RAC, and so you'll get to dive a little bit deeper in some of the work that some of the discussions we had today. But for you all who are not on the RAC, please tune in if you can. It's on Thursday, May 23rd from 9 a.m. to noon. And then the following RAC is 1 week ahead of when we come back together. So July 17th from 9 to noon, they'll get to be first to review kind of the draft rules that staff developed during the month of June. I think those are kind of the points I wanted to make and to flag to you all, and I can definitely include that in the communication I send to you all later today, or if not tomorrow, in the next couple of days. Otherwise, I just want to say quick words of appreciation to you all for the commitment, for the expertise, the compassion that we all had for one another every time we came into this space. I think I'm always amazed with the discussion, the robust discussion that comes out of here, and even more so appreciative that you all really leaned into the racial equity framework and shared that responsibility with us, because I think that is a critical piece that has really been and will be shifting the game in terms of housing production, affordability, and choice and planning generally. So with that, thank you, and please do not hesitate to reach out to me, to Celestina, to the collective group here on the project staff if you have any questions that arise in the meantime. With that, please go have lunch.
Yes.
And enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you all. We'll see you in a couple of months.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see you today.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.